What if everything you thought you knew about fame wasn't just slightly off, but a complete illusion? What if every magazine cover you smiled at, every red carpet interview you replayed, every Instagram post from your favorite celebrity was hiding a scream no one ever heard? What if laughter was a mask, and the bigger the grin, the deeper the pain beneath? We live in a world obsessed with fame. Since childhood, we are fed the idea. Fame equals success, success equals love, love equals happiness. But what if you reached the top and discovered the summit was a cliff? Imagine this, a boy named Jim, growing up in a working-class home in Canada. His father, a talented musician who sacrificed his dreams to support the family. Money was tight. The laughter in the Carey household was sometimes all they had to hold on to. Jim learned early on, if you can make people laugh, you can make them stay. If you can make them stay, maybe they'll love you. If they love you, maybe they won't leave. He wasn't just a kid who liked comedy. He was a kid who needed comedy. The young Jim stood in front of the mirror for hours, twisting his face into rubbery shapes, mimicking cartoon characters, practicing voices until his throat was raw. He dreamed not just of being good, but of being undeniable. Fast forward, Hollywood, auditions, rejections, small gigs, nights crying on cheap apartment floors, phone calls home, trying to sound upbeat so his parents wouldn't worry, until the break, the one moment every struggling artist dreams of. But here's what no one tells you. The break doesn't just open a door, it invites you into a room. And in that room, there are people who decide if you stay. These people smile, they praise, they invite you to after parties, they whisper, "You're special." But then comes the price. In court, Jim Carrey sat, trembling. His face, the one we knew from Ace Ventura, The Mask, Liar, Liar, looked like it had aged 100 years overnight. Not because of time, because of weight. He wasn't there to make jokes. He wasn't there to promote a movie. He was there to finally unload a secret he had carried for decades. He began slowly. I was 23 when I first met him. The courtroom was silent. He told me I had something, that if I trusted him, I'd go far. The man in question? Sean Diddy Combs. But this wasn't the Diddy the tabloids talked about. This wasn't the music mogul, the party king, the entrepreneur. This was the gatekeeper. Carrey described a night, a gathering that wasn't on any Hollywood schedule, a mansion tucked away in the hills, candles flickering, soft music playing, people in elegant masks, their eyes cold behind the lace, and Diddy gliding through the room like a shadow barely touching the ground. He didn't need to raise his voice. Everyone already knew who held the power. Jim remembered the moment he was asked to prove himself, not just his talent, his submission, a bathtub filled with ice water, a robe waiting beside it, a quiet room where no one watched, but everyone knew. You have to go through the cold to understand the heat of success. That's what they told him. He didn't want to do it. He wanted to run. But his dreams, they whispered louder. Sitting in that witness chair, Jim Carrey's voice broke. I did it because I thought it was the only way. He clenched his fists. I made it because I submitted. Those words didn't just shake the courtroom. They cracked open an entire conversation the world had been avoiding. Let's pause. Let's sit with this for a moment. How many stars have we watched rise, cheered for, idolized, without ever wondering what they gave up to stand in that spotlight? How many laughs did Jim Carrey give us, while inside he was haunted by that night? That cold water, that robe, that invisible contract. He spoke not of violence, but of pressure, not of force, but of seduction, not of threats, but of manipulation. He painted a picture of an industry that doesn't just look for talent, it looks for obedience. It looks for those who are willing to pay the price, whatever it may be. And it always starts the same way. You're special. You're different. You're destined for greatness. Jim Carrey wasn't trying to destroy a career. He was trying to reclaim his own soul. He spoke of the parties, the ones whispered about in industry circles, masked figures, rituals disguised as celebrations, Powerful people watching from the shadows, deciding fates with a glance. He named no names beyond Diddy, not because there weren't others, but because he knew it was never just one man. It was a system, a culture, a machine, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the world was laughing with him or at him. Imagine him on the set of Man on the Moon. So deeply in character, he started to question where Andy Kaufman ended and Jim began. Imagine the loneliness of success, the isolation of stardom, the crushing weight of knowing that every smile you give the world is another brick in the wall you're building around yourself. In that courtroom, Jim finally tore down that wall. "I don't want him to go to prison for what he did to me," he said quietly. "I want him to go to prison for what he did to all of us." He wasn't talking just about one night or one party or one price. He was talking about an industry that feeds on the desperate, thrives on the vulnerable, and rewards those willing to look the other way. The people in the room held their breath. Reporters clutched their pens. Fans watching the live stream online felt their stomachs twist. This wasn't just celebrity gossip. This was a mirror, and everyone saw themselves in it. Because who among us hasn't compromised for approval? Who hasn't said yes when we wanted to say no? Who hasn't wondered if the dream we're chasing is worth the part of ourselves we're losing? Quiet in the moments after someone speaks a forbidden truth. It's not the silence of absence, it's the silence of shock. The courtroom sat frozen. Every camera lens, every pen, every breath paused. Because what Jim Carrey had just said was not just testimony, it was an accusation. Against a system, against an era, against a culture. Outside, the media waited. The usual entertainment reporters, the ones used to covering movie premieres, red carpets, box office hits. They weren't ready for this. They weren't ready for a story that couldn't be packaged with a clever headline or tied up with a PR-approved quote. They weren't ready for Hollywood to bleed in public. But let's rewind. Before the fame, before the movies, before the fortune, there was just Jim. A boy who watched his father's dreams crumble. A boy who learned that the world doesn't reward talent, it rewards survival. He sharpened his skills not because it was fun, but because it was necessary. He had to break through. He had to prove he was worth something. Every impression, every joke, every wild grin, it was all a ticket to a better life. When In Living Color put him on the map, the world saw a star. But Jim, he saw a door cracking open, a glimpse of the world he'd always been told was waiting for him if only he were good enough. But no one tells you what's inside that world. No one prepares you for the hunger it demands. He shared in court how, in those early days, he was invited to events he didn't understand. Rooms filled with people he'd seen on TV, people who moved like gods, untouchable, magnetic, glowing under the dim light. He thought he was just lucky to be there. But then the whispers came. "He's got potential. Let's see if he can play. Invite him to the real party." And slowly the laughter he was so good at creating started to feel like a cage. One night he found himself alone with Diddy. The music was low. The guests had thinned. The air was heavy. Diddy poured a drink, looked at him with a calm smile and said, "You know what you are, right?" Jim didn't know how to answer. "You're a currency. People don't love the comedian. They love what the comedian can give them." It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. Back in court, years later, Jim's eyes filled with something between sadness and rage. "I thought I was the only one paying that price," he confessed. "But the longer I stayed, the more I saw. Actors, singers, writers, people you watch on screen today, smiling, inspiring, selling hope, and carrying wounds no one can see." He spoke of the parties, private, secret, where cameras weren't allowed, where contracts were made in whispers, and futures were bought with obedience. Let's pause, because this is the part where we have to ask ourselves, why do we love fame so much? Why do we consume celebrity stories, chase behind-the-scenes gossip, idolize people we will never meet? Because somewhere deep inside, we believe they've won a game we can't even play. They've crossed into a world we're locked out of. But what if that world isn't heaven? What if it's a prison with chandeliers? Jim Carrey wasn't the first to hint at this. Others have whispered too, in songs, in interviews, in nervous laughter. But no one had stood in a courtroom under oath and said, "Here is the price, here is the truth," until now. He described moments that chilled the room. An A-list actor, breaking down in a bathroom, muttering, "I can't do this anymore." A famous director, pulling him aside at a premiere, whispering, "They own us." A singer, sitting in a dark corner at a party, tears running down her face as her latest single played over the speakers. Jim told the court, "We were all complicit. We all wanted the dream, but no one told us what that dream demanded." The lawyers tried to shift the conversation. They wanted facts, names, dates. But Jim wasn't interested in turning this into tabloid fodder. He wasn't there to settle scores. He was there to confess, to purge. "I'm not asking for sympathy," he said softly. "I'm asking for honesty, because if we keep pretending this isn't happening, we'll never change anything." Let's go back again to the boy in front of the mirror, the boy making faces, dreaming of making the world laugh. What would he say if he could see the man now? Would he be proud or heartbroken? Jim described his early days in LA, sleeping in his car, sending a check to his family every month, even when he had barely enough for himself, believing that if he just worked hard enough, just proved himself, he could lift them all out of struggle. And he did. He became a superstar, a millionaire, a global icon. But somewhere along the way, he lost something he didn't know he'd have to give up: his peace. "I used to think the work was a sacrifice," he said, "but it wasn't. The sacrifice was me." The judge listened. The jury listened. The world listened. Because this wasn't just a trial. This was a moment of cultural reckoning. Jim Carrey was forcing us to confront a question we've all been avoiding. When we cheer for our heroes, when we buy the tickets, stream the shows, click the headlines, are we complicit too? He didn't accuse the audience, but he did ask us to see the system, to see the price, to see the human beings behind the brands, behind the characters, behind the carefully curated images. Outside the courthouse, the air was electric. News vans lined the streets. Journalists jostled for space, clutching microphones. Laptops open on car hoods, waiting for the next update. What had started as a quiet, underreported hearing had become the headline of the decade. Not because Jim Carrey was suing someone, not because someone was suing him, but because Jim Carrey, one of the most beloved faces in entertainment, had just ripped the mask off Hollywood itself. Inside, the judge sat still, his fingers folded, his eyes heavy. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some jurors looked away, others stared at Jim with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. Because this wasn't what they'd signed up for. They weren't just jurors on a case. They were witnesses to a confession that shook the foundations of celebrity culture. Jim paused. He looked down at his hands, hands that had shaped characters, molded faces, delivered jokes that made the world erupt in laughter. He clenched them slowly. "I used to believe I was free," he whispered, "but now I know. I was just another product, a product they packaged, sold, and discarded when it suited them." The lawyers leaned in. They wanted details. They wanted proof. They wanted names, contracts, signatures. But Jim didn't give them that. He gave them something much harder to quantify: the truth of an experience. "I'm not here to bury Diddy," Jim said softly. "I'm here to expose the disease that keeps us all sick." Flashbulbs popped outside the windows. Camera crews scrambled to capture any glimpse of the courtroom door. Fans, curious onlookers, and industry insiders gathered in clusters, whispering, debating, wondering. Was it true? Had they all been cheering for victims without knowing? Were their heroes secretly haunted, their triumphs soaked in hidden pain? Let's pull back for a moment. This isn't just about Hollywood, it's about power. Because wherever power gathers, there is always a price, a test, a gate you must pass through. And the more you want it, the more desperate you are to belong, the easier it is to convince yourself that the price is worth it. Jim's voice cracked as he continued. He described moments that no one had ever heard before. A director who told him, You can have this role, but I need to know you're a team player. A producer who whispered at a party, "It's not about talent, Jim. It's about trust." A casting agent who smiled too long, held his gaze too tightly and said, "Everyone pays the toll." He looked up, tears in his eyes, and said to the courtroom, "We tell young actors to chase their dreams, but we never tell them what they're chasing will chase them back." The judge cleared his throat. The lawyers exchanged sharp glances, but no one interrupted, because they knew this wasn't just a testimony, this was history. Outside, social media exploded. Hashtags trended globally. Jim Carrey testifies, Changer Hollywood revealed. Behind the mask, fans argued. Some defended him, calling him brave, a truth teller, a whistleblower exposing an industry's rot. Others dismissed him, accusing him of exaggeration, seeking attention, burning bridges. But no one, not a single person, ignored him. Inside the courtroom, Jim took a deep breath. "I remember standing on stage at the Oscars," he said, "thinking I'd made it, thinking I'd climbed the mountain, proven myself, become untouchable." He laughed bitterly. But the truth is, the higher you go, the fewer people you can trust. The more you realize that the applause isn't for you, it's for the performance. And when the lights go out, you're left alone. Let's sit with that. Imagine being loved by millions, adored worldwide, only to realize that no one truly knows you. Imagine wearing 1,000 faces until you forget which one is real. Imagine waking up one day, looking in the mirror and wondering, "Who am I?" Without the mask. The jury looked shaken. One woman wiped her eyes. A man stared blankly at the table, his jaw clenched. Because even though they weren't famous, even though they weren't part of Hollywood, they knew that feeling, that ache, that human longing to be seen, to be loved, to matter. Jim sat back in his chair. For the first time in hours, he looked lighter. Not because the burden was gone, but because he had finally shared it. He closed his eyes briefly. "I don't know what happens after this," he said softly, "but I know one thing. If we keep pretending, if we keep hiding, if we keep sacrificing ourselves on the altar of fame and power, we will lose everything that makes us human." The judge spoke. The lawyers regrouped. The courtroom moved on. But the world? The world had changed. Because once a truth like that is spoken, it can't be unsaid. Outside, the sun began to set. News anchors prepared their evening broadcasts. Fans refreshed their feeds, waiting for updates. And somewhere in Hollywood, behind closed doors, in boardrooms and mansions, powerful people watched the footage, quietly wondering, who will speak next? The next morning, the world woke up different. News channels ran Jim Carrey's testimony on repeat. Clips of his trembling voice, his raw admissions, his haunting phrases circulated like wildfire. Social media, usually a place for memes and trends, turned into a battleground of opinions. Fans posted tributes, compilation videos of Jim's greatest moments, set to melancholic music. "We love you, Jim. Thank you for your honesty. Stay strong." But the internet is never one voice. There were also skeptics, critics, doubters. Why now? Is this just a publicity stunt? He's rich. What's he complaining about? In Hollywood, the ripple effects were immediate. Agencies held emergency meetings. Publicists drafted statements. Studios quietly reviewed contracts. A few brave voices spoke up. An actress tweeted, "We all knew. We were just too scared to say it out loud." A musician posted, "Thank you, Jim, for opening the door." But many stayed silent, terrified, because they knew the system Jim described wasn't a relic of the past. It was alive, right now, thriving. For Jim, the hours after the hearing were strangely quiet. He sat alone in a small room, no cameras, no stage lights, no audience, just a man and the sound of his own breathing. He stared at his reflection in the window, watching the city skyline flicker with evening lights. He looked older than he remembered, more fragile, more real. He picked up his phone, scrolling through the flood of messages. Friends, strangers, journalists, family. Some messages were filled with love, others dripped with anger. But all of them shared one thing: emotion, raw, unfiltered emotion. Jim put the phone down. He closed his eyes. He let the silence wrap around him. For the first time in years, he wasn't rehearsing lines. He wasn't shaping a performance. He was just being, and it was terrifying. Outside, the media circus roared on. Talk shows debated endlessly. Pundits argued about Hollywood's culture, its dark underbelly, its complicity. Old stories resurfaced, actors who vanished mysteriously, deals that fell apart under strange conditions, whispers that never became headlines. Some saw Jim as a hero, some saw him as a traitor, but no one saw him as invisible anymore. In private rooms across the industry, the real reckoning began. Producers whispered, directors hesitated, agents wondered if their clients would speak next. Because Jim hadn't just broken a silence. He had shattered a wall, and behind that wall, dozens, maybe hundreds of stories waited to spill out. Let's go deeper. Why does this matter? Why does one man's confession ripple across the world? Because Jim's story isn't just about Hollywood. It's about every system, every institution, every place where power is worshipped and humanity is sacrificed. We all live under invisible pressures to conform, to impress, to succeed. We tell ourselves that if we just play along, if we just work harder, if we just smile through the discomfort, we'll be rewarded. But what if the reward isn't worth the price? What if the real victory is refusing to pay at all? Jim sat with these questions. He remembered the young actors who'd approached him over the years, asking for advice. Bright-eyed, eager, clutching their dreams like fragile glass. What had he told them? Work hard. Believe in yourself. Stay true to your craft. He never told them about the nights he cried alone, the compromises he made, the rooms he wished he'd never entered. He wondered, if he had been honest then, would they have listened? Would they have run away? Or would they, like him, have believed they were strong enough to beat the system? The door knocked gently. A friend, someone who had been with him since the early days, stepped inside. They didn't say much. They just sat beside him. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Meanwhile, around the world, people talked. In coffee shops, offices, bedrooms, people debated not just Jim's story, but their own. What dreams had they chased? What parts of themselves had they sacrificed? What masks were they still wearing? Because that's the real question Jim had placed on the table. Not just what is Hollywood hiding, but what are we all hiding? Behind the selfies, the promotions, the curated online lives, what truths are we burying because we're too afraid to face them? That night, Jim stepped outside. The city was quiet, humming softly under the moonlight. He took a deep breath, felt the cool air fill his lungs, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to perform. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if the industry would punish him, if old friends would turn away, if the world would move on. But for tonight, he had done something he never thought he'd do. He told the truth. The days after the testimony blurred together. Jim Carrey stayed out of sight. He didn't call his agent. He didn't take interview requests. He didn't scroll through the endless social media commentary. Instead, he sat alone, sometimes on the floor, sometimes on his balcony, sometimes just lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the world spin without him. His phone buzzed constantly. Some messages were filled with love. Old co-stars, past directors, people he hadn't heard from in years reached out quietly. Thank you. I'm proud of you. You said what we were too scared to. Other messages, not so kind. Industry insiders, angry executives, old friends with ties to powerful people, warned him, threatened him, accused him of betrayal. You're ruining lives, Jim. You didn't need to do this. You've just ended your career. Jim sat with the weight of it all. He thought about the roles he'd turned down, the awards he'd chased, the compromises he'd justified, telling himself, it's just the game. Everyone plays it. That's how you survive. But now he wondered, was survival ever the goal? Or was it freedom? Meanwhile, the entertainment world fractured. Studios scrambled to issue vague statements about reviewing internal practices. Agents called emergency meetings, coaching their clients on how to respond if asked. A few young stars posted bravely on Instagram, "We stand with Jim." But most stayed quiet. The cost of speaking out was too high. Behind the scenes, producers whispered, directors hushed, and boardrooms buzzed with one burning question: who will be next? Let's pause. Because this story, this moment, isn't just about Jim Carrey or Diddy or even Hollywood. It's about us. Why do we, as humans, build systems that consume the very people we claim to admire? Why do we worship fame only to delight when it collapses? Why do we cheer the rise but sharpen our knives for the fall? Power isn't just about control, it's about illusion. The illusion that if you climb high enough, you'll be untouchable. The illusion that if you smile big enough, you'll be loved. The illusion that if you stay quiet long enough, you'll be safe. Jim's friends tried to reach him. A longtime co-star left a voicemail. "Call me, Jim. Please, we need you." His sister sent a message. "We're here. You're not alone." But Jim wasn't sure how to answer. Because the truth is, sometimes when you tell a secret, you don't feel lighter. You feel naked, exposed, vulnerable. He spent hours sitting by the window, watching the city pulse below him. He thought about the fans, the people who had loved him since the 90s, who grew up with his movies, who quoted his lines, who laughed when he laughed. Would they still love him now? Would they see him as more human or less? Meanwhile, the media frenzy intensified. Late-night hosts debated whether Jim had gone too far. Podcasts dissected every word of his testimony. Columnists wrote think pieces about the dark side of comedy. And quietly, a few brave journalists began digging. Old stories resurfaced. Old victims found the courage to speak. Old wounds reopened. Let's zoom out even further. Every generation tells itself that it's different, that it's learned from the past, that it won't make the same mistakes. But over and over again, we build new empires, crown new idols, and demand the same silent submission. Because deep down, humans crave power, whether holding it or being near it. Jim Carrey, sitting alone, understood this now. He realized that his journey wasn't just about reclaiming his own story. It was about challenging an entire culture that thrives on silence. He thought about the younger generation, the rising actors, musicians, artists, who would walk into the same rooms, face the same tests, and tell themselves the same lie. "I can handle this. I'm different. I'm stronger." But here's the truth no one wants to say. No one is immune. Not the talented, not the brave, not the smart. Because the system doesn't care about your talent. It cares about your submission. That night, Jim finally picked up his phone. He called his sister. They didn't talk long. They didn't need to. He just needed to hear someone remind him that he wasn't alone. Outside, the world kept spinning. Hollywood's wheels turned. New scandals broke. New headlines flashed. The machine never stops. But something was different now. A crack had appeared. A whisper had become a roar. And somewhere in the hearts of thousands, maybe millions of people, a question had taken root. If Jim Carrey can speak, why can't I? It started as a trickle, one or two voices quietly stepping forward, a singer, an actor, a screenwriter. Each shared small pieces, half whispers, fragments of stories that echoed the same pattern. "I thought I was the only one. I thought if I spoke, I'd lose everything. I thought no one would believe me." Then came the wave. Anonymous blogs, Instagram posts, podcast interviews, names surfaced. Not just Diddy, not just shadowy figures, but a web of people, a network, a culture that had survived for decades because no one dared pull back the curtain. Until Jim did. Public opinion began to shift. At first, it was cautious, skeptical. People wondered if this was just another Hollywood scandal, just another fleeting controversy that would fade when the next headline came. But as the stories kept coming, something changed. The public stopped asking, "Is this true?" and started asking, "How deep does this go?" Jim Carrey watched it unfold from a distance. He stayed off social media. He avoided interviews. He didn't want to shape the narrative. He just wanted to breathe. For years, he had worn the mask. He had played the clown, the showman, the human cartoon who could twist his face into any shape, transform himself into anything the audience wanted. But now, for the first time, he was just Jim, and he wasn't sure who that was anymore. He sat quietly, journaling. Page after page, he poured out memories. The first time he was offered a role. The first time he felt pressured to play along. The first time he saw someone he admired crumble under the weight of the system. He wrote about his father, who had given up his own dreams, who had taught him to fight for success, but never told him what success would demand. He wrote about his mother, who had battled her own demons, and who had always told him, "Be careful what you wish for, Jimmy." And he wrote about the fans, the kids who sent him letters, telling him how his movies saved them, the adults who stopped him on the street, thanking him for making them laugh during the hardest seasons of their lives. He realized something. Even if his industry had betrayed him, his audience had never left. They had loved him, not just the star, but the soul behind the star. Even if they didn't know his full story. Across Hollywood, a quiet reckoning spread. Studios scrambled to review old practices. Agencies faced internal revolts. Powerful figures braced for exposure. Some called Jim a hero. Some called him a traitor. But everyone knew they could no longer pretend things were fine. In the middle of it all, Jim reflected on his legacy. Would he be remembered for his films, for his comedy, for his groundbreaking characters? Or would he now be remembered as the man who broke the silence, who stood on a witness stand and told the world, "This is what it cost me"? Late one night, Jim took a walk. No cameras, no bodyguards, no entourage. Just a man, alone with his thoughts, walking through the quiet streets. He paused on a bridge, leaned on the rail, and looked out over the dark water. He thought about his younger self, hungry, driven, convinced that if he just worked hard enough, he could outrun the darkness. He smiled softly. "You tried, kid," he whispered to himself. "You really did." Let's step back. This isn't just a story about Hollywood. It's not just a story about Jim Carrey. It's a story about all of us, about the dreams we chase, about the prices we pay, about the truths we hide because we're too afraid that no one will understand. Every generation has its myths, its heroes, its cautionary tales. Jim Carrey, whether he wanted to or not, had become all three. And here's the hardest truth of all. Even after the testimony, even after the headlines, even after the confessions, the system doesn't crumble overnight. Power has a way of surviving, of adapting, of finding new masks to wear. But something had shifted. A seed had been planted. And seeds, given time, given care, given enough voices, have the power to grow into revolutions. Jim didn't know what would happen next. Would he be blacklisted? Would his career end? Would he lose the love of the fans who had carried him for so long? He didn't know. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the not knowing. Because he had done the one thing the system feared most. He told the truth. Days turned into weeks. The media cycle kept spinning. New scandals emerged. New stories dominated the headlines, and slowly, as always, the world's attention drifted. But Jim Carrey wasn't watching the headlines anymore. He had stepped away, not just from the cameras, but from the noise. He spent long hours alone walking through nature, letting the world slow down, letting himself breathe. For the first time in decades, he wasn't preparing for a role. He wasn't chasing the next project. He wasn't wearing the face the world expected. He was just quiet. One afternoon, sitting by a lake, Jim watched the sunlight dance on the water. He thought about everything he had chased: success, fame, recognition, validation. He thought about the boy who had started this journey, the boy who believed that if you could make people laugh, you could make them stay, and if they stayed, you would be loved. And he realized something. The love he had chased was never about the audience. It was about himself. It was about healing old wounds, about filling the emptiness that had echoed inside him since childhood, about proving over and over again that he was enough. But here's the truth that takes a lifetime to learn. No amount of applause can silence the ache inside. No amount of fame can erase the cost of losing yourself. No amount of success can replace the simple, painful, beautiful human need to be seen, not as a star, not as a brand, not as a product, but as a person. Jim sat by the lake, feeling the breeze on his face, watching the ripples move outward, and wondered, was it worth it? Was the journey, with all its pain, with all its compromises, with all its triumphs and failures, was it worth the price? He didn't have an easy answer. He wasn't sure he ever would. Because healing, he realized, isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning to live alongside it. It's about carrying the scars, not as chains, but as reminders that you survived. Meanwhile, the world kept moving. Other artists stepped forward, sharing their stories. Fans kept discovering his old films, laughing, crying, falling in love with the characters he had once brought to life. And Jim realized that even if his career changed, even if the industry rejected him, even if the system never fully crumbled, he had done something no one could take away. He had spoken the truth. Let's pause. This story, at its heart, isn't just about Hollywood. It's about dreams. It's about ambition. It's about the invisible contracts we sign every day when we chase things without asking what they'll cost. We tell ourselves that success is worth it, that if we just climb high enough, work hard enough, sacrifice enough, we will finally reach the summit. But no one tells us that sometimes, when you reach the top, you realize the mountain was hollow. So here's the real question. What are you chasing, and what are you willing to give up to get it? Are you willing to trade your peace, your integrity, your sense of self? Because here's the hardest truth of all. No dream is worth losing yourself. In the end, Jim Carrey understood something he wished he had learned sooner. The loudest applause in the world means nothing if you can't sit in silence and love the person you are when no one's watching. And so, under the setting sun, by the still waters, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let himself rest. Not as a star, not as a headline, not as a legend, just as Jim, a man, flawed, wounded, human, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, if it made you think, if it stirred something inside you, share it. Comment below. Tell us, what does success mean to you? What have you been chasing? And is it bringing you closer to yourself or pulling you further away? Subscribe for more stories that challenge, that confront, that peel back the layers we hide behind. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can ever do is simply tell the truth. Stay curious, stay awake, stay human.